true library horror stories. Story 1: The Phantom Librarian of Redford Public Library. Chapter 1: A New Start. Sarah Jenkins was excited about her new job at the Redford Public Library. It was a small town with a close-knit community, and the library was a beautiful old building with high ceilings, wooden bookshelves, and a history that stretched back over a century. Sarah had always loved books, and the idea of working surrounded by them every day was a dream come true. She arrived on her first day with a smile, eager to meet her new colleagues and get started. The head librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Green, greeted her warmly and showed her around. There were only a few other staff members. Mr. Thomas, the elderly custodian who had worked there for decades, Lisa, a young woman who handled the children's section, and Paul, who was in charge of digital resources. As Sarah settled into her role, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just a feeling that something was off. The library was always quiet, but sometimes the silence felt oppressive, as if the very walls were watching her. Chapter 2: Strange Occurrences. It started with little things. Books that Sarah knew she had shelved would be found on tables or on the floor the next morning. Lights flickered in the stacks, and sometimes she thought she heard whispers when she was alone. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, or maybe pranks from some mischievous teenagers. One evening, as she was closing up, she saw a figure out of the corner of her eye. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but it looked like a woman in an old-fashioned dress. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. She shook her head and laughed at herself, but the unease lingered. Chapter 3: The Legend of Abigail. Curious about the building's history, Sarah started asking around. Mrs. Green was hesitant at first, but eventually told her about Abigail. Abigail had been a librarian at Redford Public Library in the early 1900s. She was passionate about her job and loved by all, but her life ended tragically when she fell from the balcony in the main reading room. Some said it was an accident, while others whispered that she had been pushed. Since then, there had been rumors of Abigail's ghost haunting the library. Mrs. Green dismissed them as just stories, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder. The strange occurrences seemed to fit with the tales she had heard. Chapter 4: The Seance. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Sarah convinced Lisa and Paul to join her in a seance. They gathered in the library after closing, lighting candles and sitting in a circle in the reading room. Paul, who was skeptical but game, brought a Ouija board. They started the seance, calling out to Abigail. At first, nothing happened, but then the planchette began to move. "Are you here?" Abigail Sarah asked, her voice shaking. The planchette moved to yes. "Why are you here?" Lisa asked. "Help," it spelled out. "How can we help you?" Sarah asked, but the board didn't respond. Instead, a chill filled the room and the candles flickered out. They heard footsteps, and then a book fell from a shelf with a loud thud. They scrambled to turn on the lights. The book that had fallen was an old ledger, the kind used to keep records of library loans. Sarah picked it up and saw that it was open to a page from the time when Abigail had worked there. Her name was written in beautiful, looping script. Chapter 5: The Search for Truth. The next day, Sarah began researching Abigail's death in earnest. She pored over old newspapers and library records, piecing together the story. Abigail had been engaged to a local man, but the relationship had been rocky. There were rumors of infidelity and jealousy. On the day she died, Abigail had a heated argument with her fiancé in the library. Sarah found an old photograph of Abigail and was struck by how sad she looked. She felt a deep sense of empathy for the woman who had loved books as much as she did. Chapter 6: Confronting the Past. One night, Sarah stayed late. determined to communicate with Abigail again. She sat in the reading room with the ledger, hoping for a sign. Hours passed, and she began to doze off, but then she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned and saw Abigail standing there, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help me," Abigail whispered. "How?" Sarah asked. Abigail pointed to the ledger and then to the balcony where she had fallen. Sarah realized that Abigail wanted her death to be acknowledged, the truth to be known. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Sarah continued her research and finally found a letter hidden in the ledger. It was from Abigail to her sister, written the day she died. In it, Abigail expressed her fears about her fiancé's temper and hinted that she was planning to break off the engagement. Sarah took the letter to Mrs. Green, who was shocked but agreed that it needed to be made public. They contacted the local historical society, and the story of Abigail's tragic death was finally told in full. Chapter 8. Peace at last. After the letter was published, the strange occurrences at the library stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted, and Sarah no longer felt watched. She liked to think that Abigail had found peace now that her story was known. Life at the Redford Public Library returned to normal, but Sarah never forgot Abigail. She kept a copy of the letter in her desk as a reminder that sometimes the past needs to be acknowledged before the present can move forward. Story 2. The Cursed Manuscript of Blackwood University Library. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Dr. James Caldwell, a professor of ancient history at Blackwood University, was always on the lookout for rare and interesting manuscripts. When he heard that the university library had acquired a new collection of old books, he couldn't wait to explore it. The collection had been donated by the estate of a wealthy collector who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. Among the volumes, Dr. Caldwell found a manuscript bound in black leather, its pages yellowed with age. The title was in Latin Maledictum Codex. Excited by his find, Dr. Caldwell took the manuscript to his office to examine it more closely. He was fluent in Latin, but the text was difficult to decipher, filled with archaic terms and strange symbols. As he worked late into the night, he felt a growing sense of dread, as if the words themselves were watching him. Chapter 2. The Curse. Over the next few days, Dr. Caldwell became obsessed with the manuscript. He barely slept, spending all his time trying to translate it. His colleagues noticed his gaunt appearance and haunted eyes, but attributed it to his usual intensity when working on a new project. One evening, as he was poring over the text, he found a passage that made his blood run cold. It spoke of a curse placed on anyone who read the manuscript, a curse that would bring madness and death. Dr. Caldwell laughed it off as medieval superstition, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. Chapter 3. The Haunting. Strange things began to happen. Dr. Caldwell's office, normally a haven of quiet and order, seemed to take on a life of its own. Books moved on their own, shadows flitted across the walls, and he heard whispers in languages he couldn't identify. He started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying. In them, he was pursued by a shadowy figure that always stayed just out of reach. No matter how fast he ran, it was always there, whispering threats and curses. Dr. Caldwell tried to confide in his friend and fellow professor, Dr. Emily Harper. She listened sympathetically but was skeptical. She suggested he take a break from the manuscript, but he refused. He was determined to unlock its secrets. Chapter 4. Descent into Madness. As weeks passed, Dr. Caldwell's behavior became increasingly erratic. He snapped at colleagues and students, neglected his other work, and spent all his time locked in his office. The manuscript seemed to have a hold over him, and he couldn't break free. One night, Dr. Harper received a frantic call from Dr. Caldwell. He was raving about the shadowy figure, convinced it was real and coming for him. She rushed to his office, finding him in a state of near hysteria. He pointed to the manuscript, claiming it was the source of all his torment. "Doctor." Harper tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. In a fit of desperation, he grabbed the manuscript and ran out of the office. "Doctor." Harper followed, but by the time she reached him, it was too late. "Doctor." Caldwell had collapsed, clutching the manuscript, his eyes wide with terror. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. "Doctor." Caldwell was taken to the hospital, but he never recovered. He slipped into a coma and passed away a few days later. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but Dr. Harper knew there was more to it. She took the manuscript to the university library, where it was locked away in the rare books section. The staff was instructed to keep it under strict security, and no one was allowed to read it. Dr. Harper couldn't shake the feeling that the manuscript was truly cursed. She spent hours researching its origins but found little information. It seemed to be a unique, malevolent artifact. Chapter 6: A New Threat. Years passed, and the memory of Dr. Caldwell's death faded. The manuscript remained locked away, forgotten by most. But one day, a curious student named Michael found his way into the rare books section. He was fascinated by the old, dusty volumes and couldn't resist sneaking a look at the Maledictum Codex. As he read the first few lines, a chill ran down his spine. He felt a presence behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. Determined to learn more, Michael took the manuscript to his dorm room. Chapter 7: The Cycle Continues. Michael's friends noticed the change in him almost immediately. He became withdrawn, spending all his time with the manuscript. He complained of nightmares and shadows that seemed to follow him. One evening, Michael didn't show up for class. His friends went to his dorm room and found him lying on the floor, the manuscript open beside him. He was muttering incoherently, his eyes wide with fear. They called for help, and Michael was taken to the hospital. He survived but was never the same. He was plagued by nightmares and visions, just as Dr. Caldwell had been. Chapter 8: The Final Solution. Dr. Harper, now the head of the history department, knew what had to be done. She took the manuscript and consulted with experts in ancient curses and dark magic. They advised her to destroy it, but she was afraid of what might happen if she did. Instead, she arranged for the manuscript to be sealed in a special vault, lined with protective wards. It was buried deep beneath the university library, with strict instructions that it was never to be disturbed. Dr. Harper hoped that this would be enough to contain the curse. As she locked the vault, she felt a sense of unease, knowing that some secrets are better left buried. Story 3: The Haunted Archive of St. Mary's College Library. Chapter 1: The Renovation. St. Mary's College Library was undergoing a major renovation. The old building, with its creaky floors and dusty shelves, was being transformed into a modern facility. As part of the renovation, the library staff had to move thousands of books and documents to temporary storage. Among the items moved were boxes of old records and archives that hadn't been touched in decades. Jane, a young librarian, was tasked with sorting through them. She loved history and was excited about the chance to uncover hidden treasures. As she worked late one evening, she came across a box labeled Restricted Curious. She opened it and found a collection of journals, letters, and photographs. They seemed to belong to a former librarian named Agnes Blackwood, who had worked at the library in the 1920s. Chapter 2: Agnes' Diary. Jane was fascinated by Agnes' diary, which detailed her life at St. Mary's College. Agnes wrote about the students, her colleagues, and the daily happenings at the library. But as Jane read further, she noticed a change in the tone of the entries. Agnes began writing about strange occurrences, books moving on their own, cold spots in the library, and whispers in the dark. Agnes' diary also mentioned a mysterious figure she saw in the library at night. At first, she thought it was a student playing a prank, but the figure appeared more and more frequently, and Agnes began to fear for her sanity. Chapter 3: The Unexplained Death. Jane's curiosity was piqued, and she decided to investigate further. She discovered that Agnes had died under mysterious circumstances. Her body was found in the library, and the cause of death was never determined. Some said it was a heart attack, while others whispered about a curse. As Jane delved deeper, she found more references to the mysterious figure in Agnes' diary. Agnes had become obsessed with finding out who or what it was. She described it as a shadowy presence that seemed to be made of darkness itself. Chapter 4: The Haunting Begins. After reading Agnes' diary, Jane started experiencing strange things in the library. Books fell off shelves, lights flickered, and she heard whispers when no one else was around. She tried to rationalize it, but the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. One night, as she was working late, she saw a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye. It was just as Agnes had described, dark and indistinct, but undeniably there. Jane felt a chill run down her spine and hurried out of the library. Chapter 5: Seeking Help. Jane confided in her friend and fellow librarian Mark. He was skeptical, but agreed to help her investigate. They spent hours researching the history of the library and found references to other strange occurrences over the years. It seemed that Agnes wasn't the only one who had seen the shadowy figure. Mark suggested they contact a paranormal investigator. Jane was hesitant, but agreed. They reached out to Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a renowned expert in the field. Dr. Warren was intrigued by their story and agreed to come to St. Mary's College. Chapter 6: The Investigation. Dr. Warren arrived with her team and set up equipment in the library. They used cameras, audio recorders, and EMF meters to try to capture evidence of the paranormal. As they conducted their investigation, the activity in the library increased. Books flew off shelves, strange noises echoed through the halls, and cold spots appeared out of nowhere. One night, Dr. Warren conducted a seance in an attempt to communicate with the spirit. Jane, Mark, and a few other staff members joined her. They sat in a circle in the library, holding hands and calling out to Agnes. At first, nothing happened. But then, the temperature dropped, and a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The EMF meters spiked, and they heard a faint voice saying, "Help me." Chapter 7: Uncovering the Truth. Dr. Warren and her team continued their investigation, focusing on Agnes' diary and the history of the library. They discovered that Agnes had been researching a dark period in the college's past. In the late 1800s, a student had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and there were rumors of occult practices. Agnes had believed that the shadowy figure was connected to this dark history. She had been trying to uncover the truth when she died. Dr. Warren theorized that Agnes' spirit was still trapped in the library, trying to finish what she had started. Chapter 8: The Final Confrontation. Determined to help Agnes' spirit find peace, Jane and Mark joined Dr. Warren in one final attempt to communicate. They gathered in the library at midnight, the time when the activity was at its peak. As they called out to Agnes, the shadowy figure appeared. This time, it was clearer, almost solid. Jane felt a surge of fear but stood her ground. "Agnes, we're here to help you," she said. The figure moved closer, and they heard a voice saying, "The truth must be known." Dr. Warren asked, "What truth, Agnes?" The figure pointed to a section of the library that had been cordoned off for the renovation. Jane and Mark hurried over and found an old, hidden door. Behind it was a small room filled with occult books and symbols. Chapter 9, Revelations. Dr. Warren examined the room and found evidence that supported Agnes' theories. The student who had disappeared had been involved in a secret society that practiced dark rituals. It seemed that the shadowy figure was a manifestation of the darkness that had been summoned. Agnes had been trying to expose the truth when she was silenced. Her spirit had been trapped, unable to move on until her work was completed. Chapter 10, Peace at last. With the evidence in hand, Dr. Warren and her team published their findings, bringing the dark history of St. Mary's College to light. The college administration was shocked but grateful for the truth. After the publication, the strange occurrences in the library stopped. Jane felt a sense of relief, knowing that Agnes' spirit had finally found peace. She continued working at the library, always keeping a special place in her heart for the brave librarian who had uncovered the truth. The library renovation was completed, and the new facility was a blend of modern technology and historical charm. The hidden room was preserved as a reminder of the past, and a plaque was installed in memory of Agnes Blackwood, the librarian who had given her life to reveal the truth.